So we begin our nutritional sciences unit talking about the three most important molecules that are needed for nutrition and for humans to function and grow. And these three molecules are called macromolecules, and we'll talk about that in a second. The main three macromolecules that we'll talk about are carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. And this video is going to introduce the concept of macromolecules, and then we will talk about carbohydrates together. So, comparison of terms. There is a term that we are very familiar with from grades 9 and 10 science, which is called a molecule, so specifically in the chemistry unit. And then there is this term macromolecule. And it's not a hard term to understand or remember. All of you have heard of the term micro. So you've heard of microbiology, microscope. We know that the word micro means something really, really small. Macro is just the opposite. So a macromolecule is a really large molecule in comparison to a single molecule. A single molecule will be small. It'll be its own entity. The definition is two or more atoms joined by chemical bonds. Molecule tends to be a term that we use with covalent molecules. So you don't need to have taken chemistry to know what a covalent molecule is. You learned that in grade 9 chemistry and then again in grade 10. And if we go down here to the levels of organization, this is all should look rather familiar to you. Okay, there are subatomic particles that make up our atoms. The atom is the smallest unit of matter. And depending on your atom, so here's an example of carbon. I'm just going to grab here the laser, I think. So this is carbon right here. When we look at a carbon atom, it is unique because it has 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Okay, so we could do the math from the periodic table and figure that out. Then we take atoms or elements and we bind them together and we form molecules. So here's a water molecule right here. And that is a very small, simple structure. A macromolecule is like tons and tons of molecules bound together. So here is a big macromolecule. Here are examples of macromolecules. This right here is an example of a protein. This right here is the double helix, classic double helix of DNA. The most important macromolecule, most people would probably say, because it contains all the information to make you who you are, me who I am, give us our unique properties, personality traits, our looks. And that is the difference between the two. So there's another term here called polymer. Okay, so a macromolecule, they say, is a large polymer made up of repeating monomer units. So what a monomer is it's just a molecule. Okay, they are the same thing, molecule and monomer. But a monomer, it would be repeated over and over and over again in a long, long chain. And we'll show you how that works as we go through the note. There are 4 important types of macromolecules in living systems, as it says here. We are only going to talk about 3 of them in our course. So if you decide to take biology, whether you take 3U, 3C, or 4U, you are going to talk about the last one here, which is nucleic acids, and the monomer unit. Okay, so remember, all of these macromolecules are the same in that they have one molecule, or sometimes maybe more than one, that are repeated over and over and over again in a pattern. So in a nucleic acid, or in DNA, the monomer unit is called a nucleotide. We are going to focus on these 3 here. Okay, so carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And a carbohydrate, I'm sure you've heard of all of these. Oh, another word for lipid is fat. Okay, that's more the common name. Lipid is more of the scientific name. But I'm sure you've heard of all 3 of these types of macromolecules. And we're just going to study the science behind them a little bit and then link them down the road into our diet and the food that we eat. So the repeating unit in a carbohydrate are sugars. Okay, you think of sugar like table sugar that we have at home that, you might add to, I don't know, tea, or in baking, we always add sugar. And that is a type of carbohydrate, but there's many other kinds, and we'll go through that. And that's our lesson today is on carbohydrates. Then you're going to see another video from me coming on fats and lipids, and their monomer unit is something called a fatty acid. And then you're going to see a third video coming from me on proteins, and their monomer unit is an amino acid. In order to build these macromolecules, because they are necessary, if we don't have them, we get sick, we can't survive. Humans, all living things will have problems if we don't get that. We need certain nutrients, okay? And there are 6 basic components that all human beings need, or any life needs, in order to be healthy and live. So carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and then there's also vitamins, minerals, and water. And those 3 are going to come later on in another video from me. So notice nucleic acids aren't there. You know, of course we need them. Okay, if we didn't have nucleic acids or DNA, like we wouldn't exist in the first place. But again, for this unit on nutrition, our DNA is not part of the food we eat. We don't eat food in order to obtain nucleic acids or DNA. So this is why we're not including it in this part of the unit. So just some background on that. Okay, so organic macromolecules, they all contain carbon, okay, all of them. So when we talk about proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, and nucleic acids, all of them contain carbon in their structures. So here is a Bohr-Rutherford diagram of carbon, and it says how many electrons does carbon need to fill its outer energy level? Well, if you remember from, again, grades 9 or 10 science, because it was covered in both, this is your outer energy level, and this is called the valence energy level. And that's really all that we care about when we talk about elements in chemistry and how they bond together to form bigger molecules. So you'll see that there's already 4 electrons in that outer energy level. And I don't know if you can remember how many there should be in that outer energy level, but there should be a total of 8, which means we would need an extra 4 electrons there. Okay, so each carbon atom can make 4 covalent bonds with other types of atoms or additional carbons simply because it needs 4 electrons, 4 extra electrons to bond with those original 4 and make bonds and make structures. Okay, so that's one thing that we just want to keep in mind is that carbon likes to make 4 bonds all the time. Here are some examples of the 4 bonds that carbon can make. So this is a little bit of organic chemistry. If you decide to take 4U Chem, you're going to learn a little bit about this. But here are 3 different molecules that contain carbon atoms. And you'll notice they have kind of similar names if you look at them. But what I want you to focus on are the bonds of carbon. Okay, so in this ethane molecule, each carbon atom is bonded to 4 different things. One carbon is bonded to the second carbon, and then that first carbon is bonded to 1, 2, 3 other hydrogens. Here in ethylene, each carbon is only bonded to 3 other substances. So there's 1 hydrogen, there's a second hydrogen, and then they're bonded to the other carbon. But it can make a double bond. So this is something to keep in mind, that carbon can make double bonds. It can also make triple bonds, as you see in the next molecule. And so then the number of other bonded atoms to the carbon changes depending on how many bonds your carbon makes to itself. Okay, so if it's already made 3 bonds over here in the acetylene molecule, it can only make 4. So 3 are used up in the triple bond. It can only bond to 1 other atom, and it tends to be a hydrogen. So these macromolecules that we talk about, you're going to notice they are primarily made up of carbons, hydrogen, and some oxygens, and sometimes a nitrogen, but primarily carbons and hydrogens. And so this is why we're just doing just a little overview here. Here are some other molecules. Here's octane. And again, if you just look at every carbon in that structure, it's bonded 4 times. Here's a benzene molecule. Benzene is actually it's a carcinogen. It's a toxic substance, but they use it a lot in lots of synthesis of pharmaceuticals, actually. And it's very interesting. You take away a hydrogen and you bond in some other type of group and you change the property right away. And this is the backbone of like, aspirin, Tylenol, allergy pills, all kinds of things have a backbone of benzene there. And every carbon that there is bonded 4 times, okay? There's a double bond involved sometimes, but again, you can see 4 bonds, okay? So there's the takeaway, 4 bonds. How do we make macromolecules and how do we break them down? Because this will happen, and I will refer to these as we go through our 3 groups, and you'll see these reactions pop up. So dehydration synthesis, okay? Synthesis means building up, okay? So we are making a bigger molecule. And the word dehydration should sound familiar to you. Dehydrating something means taking water away from it. So this is what we do is we remove a water and we add those monomer units together to form a big long chain. The opposite can happen. You can take your big long chain and then you can break it down. And we use a term called hydrolysis. Okay, so hydrolysis means we're going to hydrate something. So we're now adding water back in. They're the complete opposite of each other. Okay, so one is taking a water away and the other process is adding a water back into the molecule. So here is an example of a dehydration synthesis. So here are 2 molecules. Now, you're going to see structures like this a lot in our notes. And see this ring structure here? This is assumed that every point, so follow my cursor right here at this point, and then next door over here at that point, and here, and here, and here, and here, that those are carbon atoms, okay? Typically in organic chemistry, which is what we're kind of dealing with here, we don't draw those carbons in, simply because we don't need to. We know that every molecule in macromolecules or in nutrition will have a backbone of carbon. So we don't tend to draw them in. We just draw these line diagrams and we assume everybody knows that there'd be 6 carbons in this molecule. There's 6 carbons in this molecule as well. And if we wanted to join them together, so these would be monomers, right? Notice it's a little molecule on its own, not as little as water, but still decent, small molecule in comparison. And if we wanted to join them together, this is what we would call a monomer, okay? And it's a repeating unit. We're going to show you just joining 2, but you could have another one on this side and you could join it up and you could just keep going on and on. And notice there's got to be like an OH that we can take off and then another hydrogen that we can take off to make water. And then we're going to bond this oxygen right over to the next molecule and get a complete structure. So here it is here, okay? Now, here's our structure right here. So there it is, joined together with that oxygen. This is a separate water molecule that would be removed and floating around separately. Hydrolysis is the opposite. So we would, again, take that molecule that is already bound together and we want to break it down into its monomers. So here we would hydrolyze it, okay, or hydrate it, add water in, and then we would see we are back to our original molecule. So it is just an opposite process. So here we go, we're going to talk about carbohydrates. So again, you have a note there that you're filling in as we go through and to talk about all of these. So here are some structures of carbohydrates. And actually, here's a great structure right here. Here is the glucose molecule. And you'll see that we've actually put all the carbons in this original molecule. And I wanted you to see that because that's the last time you're going to see it written like that. We just don't tend to put those carbons in, especially if they are in a ring structure. So notice in the next molecule, they're gone, okay? But all of those OHs, the hydrogens, up here at the top of the molecule, you've got like a CH2 and then another OH. They'll put that in. But in the ring structure itself, those carbons disappear, okay? Because we just know that that's where they are at each of these points. There is an oxygen within that ring structure, so we put that in because it is not a carbon. So carbohydrates are really important because this is the fuel for humans and our energy. And all cells need glucose to make our energy, which is called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which again, if this was more of a biology unit or biology course, we would get into that detail, but this is just a science class, so we're just like doing overviews of these concepts. You all should know where glucose comes from, okay? Glucose comes from plants, and plants undergo photosynthesis, and when we talk about ecology from grade 9 science and ecosystems, every consumer, and you and I are both a consumer, because we eat food, every consumer's starting material comes from plants, okay? Even if you and I had a hamburger for lunch, okay, and a hamburger is beef, okay, or a cow, that cow ate plants, okay? And that glucose molecule just passed along through the food chain until it gets to the top carnivore, which tends to be us, and we consume it. So glucose is the most important carbohydrate that there is. If we did not have it, we would die in seconds. But we eat food and we also store it in order to have a supply of it. So you'd really have to starve yourself a long, long, long time before you ran out of glucose stores. It is what we call a simple carbohydrate. It's a monosaccharide. Saccharide is the word, Greek word, I think, for sugar. And mono means one. So it's just a single standalone sugar molecule, okay? So glucose is the most important. Here is fructose, okay? Fructose looks a little different. It's a 5-carbon ring as opposed to a 6. And here's galactose. Galactose looks really similar as well in structure. You can also have disaccharides, and disaccharides are where we have 2 sugar units attached together, and again, created through a dehydration reaction. Disaccharide, right? Di meaning 2, and we just saw an example of a dehydration reaction just before. So here's an example. We would take glucose, and we would add on a fructose molecule, okay? And again, we could do a dehydration. We can take an OH off of one of the structures. We can take a hydrogen off the other. We can make a water molecule, and then the oxygen that's left over will come right over, and it'll bond in, and you can make this molecule here, which is table sugar, okay? So there's a sucrose molecule. Sucrose that we use at home, so the sugar that we use at home, is made up of 1 glucose and 1 fructose monomer bonded together. Disaccharides, again, 2 sugar units. So there's sucrose, we just talked about that. Some of you will have heard of lactose, okay, that's found in milk. Some people are lactose intolerant, and the reason that they are is that they can't break down the disaccharide. So it's a glucose and a galactose monomer that is bonded together, and when people drink it, we have enzymes, which we're going to learn about in our body. It does not have the ability to break down those 2 sugar molecules and do a hydrolysis reaction, essentially. And as a result, those lactose molecules stay together as one bigger molecule, and it's hard for people to digest that. And your body tries to, but it's not successful, and then we don't feel well as a result. Okay, so a lot of people are lactose intolerant. And so all that they do is they take an extra enzyme that your body would naturally produce, but they don't have it. And then that enzyme in pill form will do the job that other people's bodies would do. Maltose is seed sugar. So this is the sugar in like barley and different wheats and grains, things like that. And it's made up of 2 glucose monomers. Okay, so you can have simple carbohydrates, which are monosaccharides and disaccharides, or you can have a complex carbohydrate, okay? And these we call polysaccharides. And so this term should sound familiar. So saccharide, again, means sugar units. Poly means many, okay? So this is the result now of 3 or more monosaccharides linking together. And we have to digest these, okay? So our body has to do a lot of work now to consume those polysaccharides. And this is why, just in terms of diet, those tend to be a little bit better for us than just consuming pure sugar, okay, which is a simple sugar. and doesn't require a lot of energy for us to break it down. Some of these are used for energy storage. So glycogen and starch, we kind of store in our cells, and then we slowly use it for energy throughout the day. And some of these complex polysaccharides are used for structural components. So cellulose is in like paper or wood. It gives the wood its hard structure. Chitin is the exoskeletons, they call it, of insects. So like, you know how insects have like crunchy like body parts, right? That's the chitin in there that is structural, and it helps protect those insects and their organs. So some examples of these, again, starch is in plants, glycogen is storage in animals, cellulose is in plant cell walls. Okay, so again, when I say to you about trees are a plant as well. And then chitin, right, that's how you pronounce it, chitin, is in like smaller microscopic things. So insects, fungi, bacteria sometimes. So here's an example of a polysaccharide. So look at this. Look at how many, go back. So sensitive. Okay, here we go. Look at all the different sugar molecules that are joined together. And if we just sort of go back, if we break it down, all of those would be glucose monomers. And then you can look down here, you can see them in the plant cell walls. Okay, so this would be cellulose here, strings and strings of cellulose that you would find in the cell wall of plants. So just here, the difference again between polysaccharides, right, complex carbohydrates, composed of long chains of simple sugars, usually glucose, and then there's just some examples of them. Okay, so here's examples of polysaccharides. Here's an example of chitin. So take a look at chitin, a little bit different. You've got a glucose molecule right here, but then you'll notice this extra stuff. Okay, so there's a nitrogen all of a sudden, and there's a carbon double bonded. So just different things. These are all called functional groups, folks. And I know that I do have the option to get into functional groups with you, and I'm choosing not to, just simply because, again, just more of a general science class. But if you take chemistry or biology, you know, you're going to recognize that these are an amide bond right here, the C double bond O with a nitrogen. This OH right here is called a hydroxyl. This is an ether linkage right here as you look at an oxygen sort of bonding between two molecules. Just an FYI. So again, review of our three carbohydrates. There's monosaccharides, there's disaccharides where there's two together, and then there's polysaccharide where you've got more than three or more monomers joined together in a chain. The functions of them, the primary function is energy source. Okay, so primary function of carbohydrates is that glucose molecule for human beings, for all animals, to provide us with the daily energy that we need to live, for our cells to function, all that good stuff. It can also be a structural component. Okay, so again, in plant cells, this is a plant cell. Plant cells are rectangular. We use that cellulose, which is a complex carbohydrate, for structure. They can also use it for cell-to-cell communication. So this is an example of a cell membrane. And this would be a protein here stuck on, but the carbohydrate would actually do a job of helping to communicate what goes in and out of the cell membrane. So there's other functions of it, but for you and I, we want to make sure we know these first two, okay? And all carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And I didn't go over it, but if you want to go back and count, you'll notice that they are in a ratio of however many carbons there are. So let's say there's 2 carbons, your number of hydrogens will double, and then your number of oxygens will be the same as your carbons. Okay, so they're always in a ratio of carbons and oxygens being the same amount and hydrogens being double. So dietary, and we're going to get more into the diet a little bit later in the unit. But these are our recommendations that almost 60% of calories come from carbohydrates. And this is interesting because a lot of people today not just today, but it's been the last several years, are very anti-carbohydrate. They don't want to eat them. They think they're bad for you. They think that they become fat right away. So it just depends on the types that you eat. Okay, and so again, we'll talk a bit more about that later. But this is the big one. No more than 10% of calories from simple refined sugars. So this is like table sugar. So if your diet consists of jelly beans and cookies all day long, that's going to be way more than 10% coming from like table sugar. So we want to eat foods that are high in complex carbohydrates. Okay, so grains, potatoes, breads, cereals, fruits that have a variety of carbohydrates. So again, we want to emphasize in the diet complex carbohydrates. So things like starch, things like fiber. This also helps keep us regular, okay? And fiber and starch are very good for our digestive system and our intestines, keeping us healthy. And we like simple carbohydrates, okay? So mono or disaccharides, but naturally occurring is far better than processed. So the sweetness, the sugary taste that you get from fruit, natural fruit, like if you cut up a pineapple, it's going to be far better for you to eat that than, canned pineapple, for example, that's been processed, and it probably has a bunch of sugar added to it. It's not as natural. Lactose from milk as well, right, is a natural sugar. Some people, again, have an issue digesting it, but that can be fixed. So you're going to see our cup of noodles label here quite a bit off and on. Macronutrients as an energy source, we're going to keep referring to these diet labels because, again, we're taking a unit on nutritional sciences. So we want to always be aware of the nutritional aspect of this. So this is just like, here, ramen noodle soup, okay? So this is going to be loaded in salt, but we'll get there in a bit. If you look here, there's, some calories listed, calories from fat, and we'll talk about nutrition labels in a bit. But here's our carbohydrate, okay? So the daily percentage value is only 12%. Don't look. What is the recommended dietary amount that they want us to get? It's actually 58, so we'd have to eat a lot of ramen noodle soup, okay, in order to get to 58%. This is why a varied diet is far better. So you can look here, you can notice, fat, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and again, we're looking here. They'll put sugars down, and again, we don't really care about the sugar. We care more about the fiber that's there. And you'll notice, like, the sugars are higher than the fiber. So probably this ramen noodle is probably not high or a decent source of carbohydrates. Okay, applying your knowledge. So here are 3 terms, and you have this on your note. You can think about each of these, which molecule consists of 2 sugar units, and you can jot down your answer. Which choice best describes glycogen? Okay, pick your answer. You can write it down on your note. Which type of molecule provides the basic energy for your cells? And then lastly, which type of molecule is found in milk? So out of these 3 choices, you can answer those questions. If you want to even be more specific in terms of the name of the molecule, go for it. That would be good. All right, there's your note on carbohydrates. Proteins are coming up next.